All right, get ready because today we're diving deep into something that you might not expect, the history of cats in the Middle Ages.
Yeah,
Now, forget those cute images of fluffy cats just chilling by the fire.
right.
We're going way beyond those stereotypes. We're going to uncover a story that's a lot more complex and honestly, I think way more interesting.
I agree.
We've got some amazing stuff to work with here. Archaeological findings, we're talking actual bones,
Wow,
written accounts, and even some old images to help us put this puzzle together.
that's amazing.
So what I think is super cool is that cats back then weren't exactly the beloved pets we think of today, like our little
Yeah,
furry family members.
right.
Their role in society was a lot more practical, like almost all about their skills as, get this, expert rodent exterminators.
That's exactly right. They were seen as very practical,
So like less cuddle buddy and more like four-legged pest control, right?
Exactly.
But you'd think if they were so important for keeping homes and food stores free of, all those pesky rodents,
Mhm.
people would at least feed them. But from what I've been reading, that wasn't always the case.
You're actually right to be surprised by that.
Really?
Back then, people thought that if cats were given food, they would lose their, that natural drive to hunt.
Ah, interesting.
So yeah, they believed a grumbling stomach, and the cat's hungry was the best way to keep them sharp and on their toes. Paws, I guess.
So like a tough love approach to pet care, huh?
Exactly. You could say that.
But how do we even know all this? I mean, we're talking about a time like centuries ago. It's not like those medieval cats kept diaries, right?
Diaries,
Yeah.
unfortunately, although that would be
We
fascinating.
know, right?
We actually have to uncover their stories through archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about piecing together clues
Yeah.
from, what they left behind.
Yeah.
Now, when you study these medieval cats through their physical remains,
Okay.
which mainly means bones,
Yeah.
it actually presents a really unique challenge.
Oh.
I mean, these remains, they're scarce, often fragile, and it can be really tricky to even tell the difference between wild cats
Yeah.
and the ones that lived with people, the domesticated ones.
So it's kind of like a historical jigsaw puzzle, but with some pieces missing?
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But even with those challenges, those missing pieces,
Mm-hmm.
researchers have actually unearthed some pretty incredible findings that really help us understand how cats lived, even died back then.
So some pretty cool detective work happening.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about those findings. First off, where did these medieval cats even come from? Did they just magically appear in Europe?
Well, not quite magic, but there was definitely some travel involved. It seems like, the cats actually hitched a ride with the Roman legions, as the Romans expanded their empire.
Oh, that makes sense.
They probably traveled with them, acting as pest control
Yeah.
in the military camps and all the settlements. And so,
Yeah.
we start to see this evidence of cats popping up in
Yeah.
different parts of Europe, between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD.
So Roman cats on the move. Makes sense, but what about those Viking cat graves I keep hearing about? Were cats suddenly getting VIP treatment in, the afterlife?
That's where it gets really interesting, I think. So in Scandinavia, cat remains, bones.
Yeah.
They've actually been found in graves from the Viking and Vendel eras, and that's roughly, from the late 6th to the 10th centuries.
Okay.
Sometimes they're even buried alongside high-ranking men.
Really?
We're talking about, at least 50 graves with cat remains in them.
50 graves. That's a lot. It makes you wonder if, were cats seen as more than just pest control in Viking society?
It really does. And, we can't be totally sure without those written accounts from those who were buried.
Yeah.
But these findings,
Yeah.
they could suggest that maybe how cats were viewed was starting to shift, maybe just a little bit.
Yeah.
Perhaps they were seen as companions, for the afterlife.
Right.
Or maybe their presence had some sort of symbolic meaning, something related to that journey to the next world.
Maybe they were even seen as, good luck charms for the afterlife. I mean, who wouldn't want a skilled mouser around, even in the next realm, right?
Ah, that's a good point. Or maybe even status symbols, especially if certain types of cats were more prized than others.
Yeah.
It's really a fascinating puzzle, and it's one that researchers are still trying to figure out.
It's like those Viking cats took their secrets with them to the grave.
Yeah, they did.
But speaking of intriguing discoveries, we can't forget about the fur trade. Turns out, medieval cats weren't just keeping Barnes rodent-free, they're also making a fashion statement.
That's right. When we look at the archaeological evidence, it reveals this whole other side to the story of the medieval cat.
Wow.
We see marks on their skulls and jawbones. that actually indicate that their fur was very carefully removed,
Really?
suggesting that they were used, well, in the fur trade.
So from pest control to high fashion, medieval cats were multi-talented.
That's right. And we're not talking about some small-scale thing here.
Okay.
There's a well in Cambridge, England,
Wow.
and it yielded the remains of 80 cats, and they all showed signs of having their fur removed.
80 cats. That's a lot.
And we find similar evidence all across Europe, pointing to a fur trade that was, well, pretty well organized
Yeah.
and surprisingly large scale. They used those cat pelts.
It really paints a picture of, like, how resourcefulness, even when it came to something as, ordinary as cats, it played such a big role in medieval life. It's fascinating.
Now, before we move on, we do have to address something a bit, well, sensitive.
Oh.
Something that modern cat lovers might find a little, squeamish,
I think I know where you're going with this. We're talking about whether those medieval cats ended up on the dinner plate.
You got it.
Yeah.
And it might not be a pleasant topic, I know,
Right.
but it's important to the story, and we need to approach it, well, with sensitivity and keep in mind the historical context.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a reminder that life back then was often really, really harsh, and survival sometimes meant, well, making difficult choices. But just how common was it to actually eat cats back then?
So the evidence suggests it wasn't a regular thing like an everyday meal,
Okay.
but it definitely happened.
Oh.
You remember those 80 cats from the Cambridge well?
Yeah.
Well, some of them, they showed signs of, being butchered,
Oh, wow.
suggesting that they might have been, well, consumed.
Okay.
And we see similar findings in 14th century France.
Really?
Yeah.
It seems like cat consumption, while not exactly a culinary staple, wasn't totally unheard of back then. It's a good reminder that our feelings today don't always line up with, what happened in the past. But let's switch gears a bit and talk about how people's ideas about cats started to, change, especially as the church became more influential.
Yeah, that's where things get even more, well, complex.
Okay.
As we get into the later Middle Ages, we start to see more written accounts popping up,
Right.
and they show us kind of a darker side to this whole cat story.
Really?
Yeah, we see cats, especially black cats,
Oh.
being associated with witchcraft and the devil.
Wow.
And this is partly because of what the church was saying.
So from, skilled pest controllers and even fashion icons,
Right.
cats suddenly become symbols of evil. That's a pretty big change.
It was a big shift, and it really reflects the anxieties and the uncertainties of that time.
I see.
I mean, remember, the later Middle Ages, that was a period marked by, plagues, wars, religious fervor. People were looking for answers, for something or someone to blame for all the bad things happening around them.
So cats with their, nocturnal habits and kind of mysterious vibe
Yep.
became easy scapegoats.
Exactly. Cats, especially those sleek black ones, were increasingly tied to, well, witchcraft, heresy, things like that.
Wow, so they really went from hero to zero, huh?
You could say that. We see accounts of cats being tortured or even killed, often connected to those accusations of witchcraft.
It's hard to imagine, how drastically their image changed. From being, valued for their practical skills to being demonized and feared. It makes you wonder if people just forgot how helpful they were at, keeping those rodent populations down.
It's a good point, It's very possible that that the practical need for rodent control was still there,
Yeah.
even with all those superstitions and fears around cats. Remember, the historical record isn't always, neat and tidy. There are a lot of nuances and contradictions.
Right, of course. So even while some people were hesitant to keep cats around because of these bad associations, others probably still saw them as, valuable mousers.
Exactly.
Right.
And even within the church, there were different opinions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some of the monastic orders, they actually liked having cats around
Interesting.
because they were good at protecting those precious manuscripts from, getting damaged by rodents. They kept cats in their libraries because they realized how important they were for preserving knowledge.
So those medieval bookworms had cats to thank for saving all those literary treasures.
That's right.
I love that. It shows that even when cats were being, demonized, some folks still appreciated their talents.
It really shows how complicated the human-cat relationship was back then.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one thing or the other. It was a mix of practical stuff, superstition, religious beliefs, even personal preferences. It's fascinating.
Totally. Okay, so we've been talking about those connections to witchcraft and the devil, but was this negative view everywhere in Europe? Or were there some regional differences?
That's a great question, and it's something that historians are still debating. The strength of those negative feelings likely varied depending on where you were.
Okay.
In some places, cats might have just been seen as bad luck or like a bad omen,
Yeah.
while in others, their usefulness as pest control might have been, more important than any superstitions.
So it wasn't like a black and white situation or, I guess, a black cat and white cat situation everywhere.
Exactly. And you also have to remember, even in the same community, you could have people with totally different opinions about cats.
Right, for sure. We've been talking about medieval cats in general, but I'm curious, were there like specific breeds or types of cats that were more common or maybe, more feared or favored back then?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, those historical sources don't always give us those specifics, but based on what we see in the skeletal remains, it seems like medieval cats were generally, well, smaller and slimmer
Okay.
than a lot of the breeds we see today.
So no fluffy Persians or like majestic Maine Coons strutting through medieval
Yeah,
villages?
probably not. They were probably closer in looks to, like, the European wildcat
Interesting.
with a more streamlined build, good for hunting.
Makes sense given that their main job was pest control, like efficiency and being effective. That's what made a good medieval cat.
You got it. And while we might not have, detailed descriptions of specific breeds,
Hmm.
we can imagine that there was still this whole variety of cats roaming around
Yeah.
in those medieval streets and the countryside,
Right.
each one with its own personality and, maybe even its own story.
Like a glimpse into a whole hidden world
Yeah,
full of these feline characters that we can only, imagine. But one thing's for sure, those medieval cats were like tough and adaptable.
absolutely.
They were survivors, proving their worth even when they were dealing with all that superstition and fear. And like we'll see, their story gets even more interesting as we move into the early modern period.
That's right. Those medieval cats had a lot more to offer, both literally, and figuratively.
So we've explored the lives of these medieval cats, from their, awesome skills as pest controllers to, well, those not so great encounters with the fur trade. And of course, we talked about those darker times when they were linked to witchcraft. But as we approach the end of the Middle Ages and move into like the early modern period, we see this really cool shift in how they were perceived. It's like those medieval cats were finally getting the appreciation they deserved.
It really is a remarkable turnaround.
Yeah.
Those superstitions, they stuck around for a while.
Right.
But we see this gradual softening in attitudes towards cats.
Okay.
Writers and artists start portraying them in a more positive light, like emphasizing their elegance, their playfulness, even their smarts.
Yeah.
It's almost as if they were rediscovering the cat, seeing past those negative stereotypes.
So from symbols of evil to objects of admiration, what caused this change of heart?
Well, I think one big factor was a growing appreciation for their companionship.
Ah.
That might not have been something people talked about much in those earlier centuries.
Right.
But people started to recognize that, hey, you can actually have a special bond with these, fascinating creatures.
Yeah.
Cats weren't just useful tools anymore. They were becoming companions, even friends.
It's really interesting how our perceptions can change so much over time. What was once feared or misunderstood can become, like, treasured. But did this shift in how people saw cats actually change how they were treated?
Absolutely. This new appreciation for cats happened right around the same time they were becoming more popular as pets, especially among, the upper classes. Owning a cat, especially one that was rare or exotic, became a way to show off your wealth and status.
So having a cat became a status symbol, huh? Kind of like the medieval version of those, Instagram famous pets we see today.
Yeah, you could say that. And this
Mhm.
wasn't just happening in Europe either.
Okay.
In other parts of the world, like Egypt and Asia, cats had been revered for a long time,
Right.
for their spiritual and symbolic meaning.
So those medieval cats were tapping into something universal, something that went beyond just, cultural boundaries.
Exactly.
But how did this new appreciation lead to the, beloved cat companions we have today?
Well, it's a gradual process, but you can see the beginnings of that modern relationship forming. As cats moved from, the barn to the living room, they stopped being just tools.
Yeah.
They were becoming part of family life, and people started to appreciate their individual personalities, their little quirks.
It's amazing to think about how far they've come.
It really is.
From those days of tough love, relying on a growling stomach to motivate them, to becoming cherished parts of our families. I guess it's true what they say. Every cat really does have 9 lives, each one with its own unique story.
and each one leaving its mark on history. It's a reminder that how we relate to animals, it's always changing. What seems normal to us today might have been totally bizarre back then.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the medieval cat world, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that history is full of surprises.
Hmm.
Even the most seemingly ordinary creatures, like, the cats that share our homes,
Yeah.
they have these amazing stories to tell. And by digging into those stories, we can learn so much, not just about them, but about ourselves,
Right.
about how we relate to nature, and about that fascinating web of history that connects us all.
Well said. And who knows? Maybe this deep dive has made you look at your own feline friend a little differently, with a new appreciation for the journey that brought you together. So the next time your cat snuggles up with you for a purr session, think about their ancestors, those Roman travelers, those Viking grave companions, even fashion icons.
That's amazing.
It makes you wonder, how will future generations see our relationship with cats? Will they think we're their devoted servants or something totally different? That's something to think about, isn't it? Thanks for joining us on this journey through the fascinating world of medieval cats. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into history.